জন্য ক্ষমা চেয়ে নিই। আমি কিন্তু একটা ভাষায় বলবো না, আমি দুটো ভাষা মিলিয়ে বলবো। সুতরাং এবং তার মানে একটা কারণ যেটা আমার মাথায় ছিল সেটাই আপনাদের সঙ্গে একটু ভাগ করে নিতে চাই। যে বাংলা সাহিত্যকে আমরা বাংলায় থেকে যেভাবে দেখি, বাংলা সাহিত্যকে আমরা দূর থেকে একটু অন্যভাবে, ভুল ঠিকের কথা নেই, কিন্তু দূর থেকে একটু অন্যভাবে দেখি। তো তো দৃষ্টিভঙ্গিটা যেহেতু আলাদা, সেহেতু আমি একটু চেষ্টা করব, মানে চেষ্টা করব না, করেই ফেলেছি অলরেডি, যে দুটো ভাষাকেই যদি আনতে পারি। এছাড়াও দু একটা এমন লেখার উল্লেখ করতে চাই যেগুলো বাংলায় লেখা নয়, কিন্তু যেগুলোর সঙ্গে বাংলা সাহিত্যের কিছু মানে যুগান্তকারী রচনার কথাই আমি বলবো, বিশেষভাবে স্বাধীনতা আন্দোলনের সঙ্গে যেগুলো সম্পৃক্ত বা যেগুলো আমাদের মনের মধ্যে গেঁথে আছে, সেগুলো বাংলায় কিভাবে সেই সব ধ্যান ধারণা প্রকাশিত হচ্ছে এবং বাংলা সাহিত্য দ্বারা অনুপ্রাণিত হয়ে কিংবা ইন রেসপন্স টু সেই লেখা ভারতের কিছু অন্য ভাষায় কিভাবে সেগুলো প্রভাব ফেলছে। এবং এটা বলার জন্য তার আগে প্রথমত দু তিনটে জিনিস বোধহয় একটু খোলসা করে নেওয়া উচিত। এক, এই টুল বা ওয়েপন, এই দুটো শব্দ, মিররের দিকে আমি যাচ্ছি না, দর্পণ, কেন তাতে বোধহয় আমরা সবাই একমত যে হ্যাঁ, সাহিত্য নিশ্চয়ই সমাজেরই দর্পণ। এই বিষয়ে কোনো বোধহয় বিতর্ক নেই, বা বিতর্ক আমি কিছু তৈরিও করতে চাইছি না। কিন্তু যে জিনিসটা নিয়ে একটু ভাবার, মানে আমাকে তো অন্তত ভাবিয়েছে যখন সাহিত্য একাডেমি থেকে আমাকে বলা হলো যে লিটারেচার অ্যাজ আ টুল অফ মাস আপরাইজিং, এবং আরো জেনারেসলি সেটাকে বাড়িয়ে দিয়ে এটা বলা হলো যে ইন বেঙ্গলি অ্যান্ড আদার লিটারেচার্স, এবং তার সঙ্গে কম্পারেটিভ শব্দটি আই সাপোজ যে আমি আমার পেশা যা তার সঙ্গে জুড়েই আমাকে মানে সেই শব্দটি জুড়ে দেওয়া হয়েছে শিরোনামে। এগুলো সবকিছু মাথায় রেখে শুরু করছি। I will not be speaking of literature as a tool of mass uprising. এটা প্রথমেই বলে নেওয়া দরকার। না টুল না ওয়েপন, দুটোর মধ্যে কোনোটাই আমার মনে হয় না সাহিত্য। Literature is not a tool for anything. I don't want to go back to the fundamental idea of kavya and its distinct nature, the tradition of naming narratives, of analyzing categorization, and of a script culture beginning with the possibilities of the uttered word goes so deep in the mind of the Sahriday of Indian literature that reducing it to a tool of anything is simply succumbing to lazy thinking at best and slander at worst. The province of Shahitya, which also traditionally is supposed to forge Shohitattva or be created in the communion of Shabd and Arth, Shabdo Artho, as indicated by Bahama, is certainly Kavya, and it will serve no purpose if we think of it as a tool. So I would like to talk about roles rather than instruments, drawing upon Shishir Kumar Dash's idea of the integration as a way of understanding the idea of India, extended by Omyodev's insight that Indian literature is an interliterary condition. Literature's role in mass uprising towards freedom is to configure the experiences of mass movement, freedom, and certainly the experience of literature as human and humanizing activities. Literature as an event of reading is the experience and expression of relations, which takes me, the reader, to another world. In other words, the reader is called upon to weave a web of her own, the pleasure of literature, which of course cannot be swallowed up by instrumentalization. This emphasis on the choice of words is because the Shahitya Academy does indeed play a role in our very access to many Indian language literatures and provides us a platform regularly to reintroduce ourselves to our plurilingual literary milieu. hence falling prey to this eventuality that language can be used as an instrument for what Aristotle would describe as political rhetoric, undifferentiated from literary devices and fiction, which is today a serious threat to the health and well being of our plural society. Every Indian language inherits residues of various aesthetic and poetic traditions depending upon the local realities and language culture. So when I speak of Bengali as an Indian language, I speak of a common heritage and history, sometimes very close, sometimes remote, with many other Indian languages, and the cultures related to them. Literature in any Indian language has these reserves to draw upon: a common history that can be identified as related and hence Indian, plus a common literary tradition that can also be identified as Indian. Neither of these, historical or literary, reduces Indian to any single characteristic, except its geographical unity and cultural plurality. Rather, a common history is lived by every community in its own way, and there will remain some elements of it that cannot be generalized. The idea of literature as a tool for mass uprising can well be attributed to the scholarship in English on early Indian novels, most precisely Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anandomat. The foundational myth about political novels in Indian languages originates in the characterization of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anandomat as a flawed historical novel, which inspired the militant revolutionaries of the time of its publication. And this view comes from Meenakshi Mukherjee, যিনি কিনা প্রথম বঙ্কিমের আনন্দমঠ যে পলিটিক্যাল নভেল এবং ফ্লড পলিটিক্যাল হিস্টোরিক্যাল নভেল এই কথাটা রিয়েলিজম অ্যান্ড রিয়ালিটিতে লিখেছিলেন। তারপরে সেটা আমাদের দেশব্যাপী নানা শিক্ষা প্রতিষ্ঠানে ওপর নিচ মধ্য সব জায়গায় চাউর হয়ে গেছে অ্যাজ ইফ ইট ইজ আই মিন দ্য ওয়ার্ড অফ গড। কিন্তু আসলে Bankim's agenda was the awakening of what he thought of as the demasculinized, debauched Bengali Jati under the rule of Islam. His chosen event to convey this message was the Sannyasi rebellion, in representing which he brought together the worshippers of Shakti, practitioners of blood sacrifices, with the ascetic, disciplined Karma Yogi, epitomized by Krishna, whom he modeled in his Krishna Charitra after Christ in Exe Homo. Bankim was careful to state that he was writing fiction. He had no claims of writing either history or historical fiction for that matter. Bankim was careful to state that he was writing fiction, but scholars inspired by the English canon of realism and the post colonial canon of linking the novel with the nation insisted that Bankim had written that strange Dakupain Eta Hashcharu, a historical novel, terming his use of the Sannyasi rebellion as an anachronism. This I'm quoting from Meenakshi Mukherjee. His use of the Sannyasi rebellion as an anachronism, as if he had made a historical mistake in setting a backdrop in 1771 while he was writing in the 19th century. The short of this was that the fictional Onushilon Shomiti of Anandamot inspired many militants and finally fueled fundamentalist Hindu nationalism, which visualized the nation as both a mother goddess in need of brave sons to uphold her honor and an avenging female force which destroyed all evil with her bloodthirsty might. No doubt, iconography played a role in the mass uprising towards freedom. It legitimized fundamentalist terrorism by linking it both with gender and religion, which, as I have just remarked, was not Bankim's intention. So the formulation, literature as a tool of mass uprising, is built, it would appear, on false premises. It is also criticized by Rabindranath in Ghore Baire, marking exactly what modern scholars read it as, an incitement to mass uprising. Bimola's husband, who is he needs no introduction to this audience. Bimola's husband Nikhilesh, তার সম্পর্কে বিমলা যেটা বলছেন, বন্দে মাতরমটি তিনি চূড়ান্ত করে গ্রহণ করতে পারেননি। তিনি বলতেন, দেশকে আমি সেবা করতে রাজি আছি, কিন্তু বন্দনা করব যাকে তিনি দেশের চেয়ে অনেক উপরে। Bankim's depiction of militant nationalism in fiction was opposed to his advocacy of Onushilon or discipline. as the dharma of human life. The image of the nation as mother and the reading that makes Bunkin the author of militant nationalism, fueled by ascetic warriors, vowing to protect a benign mother figure by becoming devotees of a bloodthirsty goddess, manipulates the fictionality for political ends. As Rabindranath points out in ঘরে বাইরে, যেখানে উনি বলছেন যে বৃহৎ সবার হৃদয় তুলে দুলে ফুলে ফুলে ওঠে ওঠে ফুল ছাপিয়ে ভেসে যাবার জোর, প্রত্যেক কথায় যেন ভোরের দমকা হাওয়া। বাংলাদেশের সমস্ত নারীর প্রতিনিধি আমি, আর তিনি বাংলাদেশের বীর, তিনি বলতে সন্দীপ। সুতরাং this is the effect that Shandip has upon the gathering, where Bimala herself, কিছুক্ষণ আগে বিমলা কিন্তু এই কথাটিও বলেছে যে তার চোখে উজ্জ্বলতা আছে বটে, কিন্তু চেহারাটা অনেকখানি খাদে মিশিয়ে গড়া। চোখে আর ঠোঁটে কি একটা আছে যেটা খাঁটি নয়। ভাবখানা গরিবের মতো নয়, তপস্বীর মতো নয়, দিব্যি বাবুর মতো। So Tagore, a deep and keen critic of rhetorical as well as operational strategies of mass uprisings and militant movements. The central main characters in Tagore's novels, Lilaranda Shami হোক আর শচীশী হোক, সন্দীপী হোক আর ইন্দ্রনাথী হোক, are all possessed by the will to control through the power of language. The narrators in each of these novels are subdued, overawed by the dazzling characters of the previously named heroes, but directly questioning the glamorous political heroism of the central male character with their own lives, thought, and friendship. The critique is highlighted through the characters of the women and the effect that these diverse forms of masculinity have upon their lives. The ardent Bimala, whose desire is to serve, is opposed by her husband's desire for her to act independently, is swayed by Shandip's rhetoric. She is enthralled to a political cynicism that she herself had earlier suspected when she first saw Shandip. That চেহারাটা উজ্জ্বল, কিন্তু কিছু খাদ আছে ঠোঁটে এবং চোখের কোণে, কিছু একটা আছে যেটা খাঁটি নয়। ভাবখানা গরিবের মতো নয়, তপস্বীর মতোও নয়, দিব্যি বাবুর মতো। In their own righteous greatness, confident in their class and caste and gender privileges, these men, the Swadeshi Vidrohis, legislate the future of the masses by their language, showing how it can become a tool to whip up emotions. That is the effect that Shandip's rhetoric has on Bimala. Bimala feels herself to be the representative of all the women of Bangladesh, and Shandip is the brave heart, the bir or the hero of their land. Rabindranath exposes the unabashed manipulation of other human beings as inherently political in Charodhai, where it is the manipulation of weakness by Ella's mother or manipulation of others' weakness or others' weaknesses by Indranath himself. শক্তির গোড়ায় নিষ্ঠুরের সাধনা, শেষে হয়তো ক্ষমা। আমরা কামিনী কাঞ্চন ত্যাগী নই, যেখানে কাঞ্চনের প্রভাব সেখানে কাঞ্চনকে অবজ্ঞা করি না, যেখানে কামিনীর প্রভাব সেখানে কামিনীকে বেদিতে বসিয়েছি। শুধু মা মা স্বরে দেশকে যারা ডাকাডাকি করে তারা চিরশিশু। দেশ বৃদ্ধ শিশুদের মা নয়, দেশ অর্ধনারীশ্বর। মেয়ে পুরুষের মিলনে তার উপলব্ধি, এই মিলনকে নিস্তেজ করো না সংসার পিঞ্জরে বেঁধে। The role of literature here is not as a tool, but as a reflection upon mass uprisings. In literature, we can sense the success or the failure of mass uprisings, not as historical facts, but as the experiences that people have, the effect it has on people's lives. Those who participated, those who held aloof, those who supported, and those who crushed these uprisings. The Sannyasi rebellion was the backdrop of Bunkim's Anandamot. In 1770 occurred the first uprising of Tilka Maji against the East India Company and the zamindars who systematically colluded to bring the Shautal into a cash economy and force them to accept the so-called law of the land perpetrated by the British colonizers, whose very aim was to exploit the resources that the Shautals had lived in harmony with. The destruction of the forest and forest peoples, along with the imposition of a Hindu civilization in which the caste system and patriarchy were regulating institutions of oppression, went hand in hand. The first rebellion of the Shautal Tilkamaji of Bhagalpur is recorded in Mahashita Devi's 1942 novel Shalgira Take. In the 30 years that intervened until Mahashita Devi won or wrote the award-winning Aranya Rodhikar, translated into a number of Indian languages. She had already documented the Shidhu Kanu rebellion in the 19th century, Visha's uprising in the 20th, and the rising of Choti Munda, all uprisings among the mass which is deprived of literacy in colonial and imperial India. It is through literature that this story of this mass uprising, spread of the battle against exploitation, against the destruction of resources, and of a culture related to the preservation of natural resources for use rather than their commodification by neocolonial global capital. The earliest uprising, therefore, came from those who were being doubly colonized by the world system and by the social and religious stratification, and deprived of their way of life by imperial capital that has not changed even today. Only neo-colonial global capital has replaced imperial global capital. And all discriminations, as Justice Ganguly just said, are official, perpetrated by the state. The culture of Bengal, undivided by narrow domestic walls, in the passionate worship of the God who lives in every human and in the singer himself, joining all through humanity, was heard in Nojrul's uncompromising rejection and scathing attacks on religious bigotry, caste, gender, and racial privilege, and the imperial economy. Nojrul's poetry may well be a call, but not a tool, of mass uprising against all these deprivations and exploitation linked to each other. He called to the nation as a plural entity, imagining the equality of differences. His was not the liberal humanist plural nation, but the stark, harsh reality of the prison of inequalities to be burnt to ashes, ground to dust. A rebel poet who openly challenged all stratifications and discrimination. Nojrul's poetry had the force and fire to be akin to an uprising, an inspiration, and not a tool. Sri Rangam Srinivasa Rao, Sri Sri, wrote in Telugu Maro Prapancham, Mahaprasthanam in 1930-40s. That is when the book was published. The poems were written across this time. And Maro Prapanchanam is towards another world, a Mahaprasthan, a final exit towards a better and a more equal world. With equal fervor, inviting the mass of today to another new world, not with the humanist didactic precepts of another Telugu poet, Gurjada Apparao, whom powers that we have quoted recently, talking about Deshamunu Premanchumana, meaning brother, love the country, but with the rhythmic militancy and socialist zeal of Nazrul. Rabindranath alerted the reader of literature to political rhetoric and political expediency, asking whether the nation was not an imposed parochial political goal. And I connect his response to Japan trying to spread nationalism, its own brand of power and nationalism across Asia, with the not the anger, but with the dismay and I think the sadness which Gopati has already referred to. The implementation of those ideals was evident in the mass uprisings of the Swadeshi movement, as well as the fiery militancy that claimed youth from Bengal to Punjab, influenced by the First World War. Ghore Baire exhibits Rabindranath's critique of feudal patriarchy and the gendered oppression that have led to the need for a social revolution, which is compromised by politics, which is molded by the political rhetoric of emotion. Bimola is enchanted by the manipulation of rhetoric, political and emotional. And the goal of the freedom movement is diverted into a personal tragedy. The real uprising, which must accompany the political, according to Rabindranath, as in Bankim also, is not only against the British colonizers, but for the creation of a human self internally free of the belief in stratification and discrimination, whether of race, caste, class, or gender. Rabindranath's romanticization of work and aestheticization of leisure presents a humanist ideal that will be an alternative to feudal patriarchy. Gandhi also urged individual action and ahimsa as a way of meeting opposition, and hence his desire for truth in the face of injustice becomes a collective bondage or a collective desire because each one is responsible for her own actions and how that is the individual action, affects or achieves a common good. The definition of a mass uprising in Gandhian terms would then include Swaraj, that is, rule over self, rather than succumbing to manipulation or lazy thinking or political rhetoric. A responsible politics by individuals brought together by a society through a specific method, that of non-violent satyagraha. Gandhi withdrew the non-cooperation and civil disobedient movements after the violence against the rulers in Chauri Chaura, because it proved that the ideal of ahimsa, the rule over self, had not been achieved. Satyagrahis should learn to discipline anger and violence out of themselves. Shodhinath Bhaduri and Phanishwarnath Renu locate their fictitious worlds in the same real district, Purnia, which was influenced by the heat of an uprising which leads Gandhi to call off the movement in 1922. We see in Dorai Churik Manush and in Maila Anchal the role of literature as a follower of people's lives during a mass uprising whose aim is freedom. The nature of that freedom, the idea of India they imagined and wanted to be left free to create, occupied writers and their characters from the time of Tagore's Ghore Baire. Bhaduri and Renu, writing in the decade of independence between 1945 and 50, inflected it with the plurality of voices which actually formed the Indian reality. In Vibhuti Bhushan's Arunnak of 1939, the narrator meets Bhanumati, a woman of the Rajgond community, who claims that they are the rulers of the Santals. He asks her if she knows which country they live in. In Gaya Jila, says Bhanumati. Have you heard of Bharatvarsho? He asks. She says she has not. Bharatvarsho Kontike, as you are all aware of. Vibhuti like all conscientious nationalist writers, is aware of the ignorance of the literate, educated, novel reading, thinking class about the many voices that constitute the reality of India. Both Shotinath Bhaduri and Mahashweta Devi, at different times in the history of Bangla literature, have caused us to hear the linguistic plurality not only of Bengal but of India. Dorai Churik Manush, for example, as we all know, is written in Bengali for the Bengali reader. The perspective is not that of an educated middle class urban Bengali, but the untouchable orphan Dhorai who lives on the outskirts of the caste divided Bhari Saher, Jirania in Purnia. So, different registers of the local languages, Hindi spoken by different classes and castes, the languages spoken by the English administrators, the professional Bengali classes, the Rajput landlords, through these multiple voices and perspectives, we participate in the spread of Gandhi's non cooperation and civil disobedience movement and its change into a violent mass uprising. Seen from Dorai's perspective, a class and caste based critique of this movement is actually presented. In actuality, Bhaduri and Renu were witnesses to the internal stratification and corruption that led to the splintering of Congress and the founding of the Socialist Party in 1942. In fiction, Thorai is an untouchable in a stratified society which Gandhi is battling to rid of both caste discrimination and British domination through the power of democracy. In these novels, we see the rising consciousness of the mass about their rights that was made possible by the advocacy of social change and the formation of a new self that does not adhere to discrimination, even if society remains diverse and stratified. Set in the United Provinces, where elections first brought an Indian party to power, Dorai Churit Manush introduces the excitement and the wonder of democracy in an unequal society. Gandhi brings to the poor, untouchable Dorai the panacea for all his ills. Ram Rajyo through the ballot box, the means to a silent, anonymous, but mighty mass uprising for rights through the strength of numbers as a collective desire for truth. Sadgiriya or Satyagraha of Mahatmaji. However, caste politics as well as an individual immorality defeat this great goal, as we see in Renu's Maila Anchal. The corruption in the Congress following power, which Gopati also has referred to, is intensified by caste and religious power. The link between self styled religious leaders and politicians and their joint exploitation of lower caste men and women is the story of the mud in Renu's fictitious Maryganj, where the hapless Lakshmi is rescued only to become a sex slave to the Sevadar. The mass uprisings fail, whether they are violent or non-violent, and they underline the actual obstructions to freedom and progress. These obstructions are not political, but social. The reality of caste, the oppression of women, which writers in Indian languages cannot ignore, as they are characteristics of our mass society. Uprisings, as we have seen, are fueled by these inequalities, and their course and success are dependent upon how they address these inequalities, which we see in Thorai Churit Manush, which express themselves as hypocrisy in the behavior of great political leaders and militant radicals. The reality of caste in the mass uprising for freedom enters Bengali literature in many works which include Shotinath and the rape of the forest by imperial global capital enters it through the work of Mahashita Devi, though these are indeed the earliest mass uprisings to occur in Bengali literature. Thus, as we have discussed, because of the deprivation due to stratification, the ills of Hindu society, the oppression of women, and the predominance of caste are pointed out by Tilka Majhi's father Sundra in Shalgira Take to his ostracized Hindu ironsmith neighbor Ratun Muni. The Santal society is opposite in both cases. Its desired freedom is from economic exploitation of resources, not from caste or from gender oppression, but from freedom from economic exploitation of resources, while Hindu society must struggle to free itself from what Ambedkar identified as the internal divisions, without which any notion of community is a delusion. In Bengal, radical reforms in gender organization were debated and implemented, beginning with the remarriage of widows and the abolition of sati, up to the education of women. The innate strength of women abounding in Sharat Chandra's novels is Sharat Chandra was translated in practically all Indian languages, and people also, I mean, there have been stories of people saying that Sharat Chandra wrote, I mean, in Kannada or Tamil or Telugu because they did not see the difference between what he wrote and what they were undergoing, despite the fact that the novels were translated from Bengali into other languages. But even before Sharat Chandra, in 1897, we have Gurjada Appa Rao's Kanya Shulkam in Telugu, which talks about the price that is to be paid in order for a woman to be married. So he was talking about or against the dowry system from the time of that the century turned. And in that sense, the innate strength of women abounding in Sharat Chandra's novel, translated into many Indian languages, took the image of the ordinary woman, Sharat Chandra's Shadharun Mein, across the country. But the right of women to their sexuality, their freedom from stigmatization of expression of sexual desire, remained a contentious subject despite the popularity of Sharat Chandra. And between 1917 and 1933, as we all know, Sharat Chandra wrote Srikanto in 4 volumes. And in Srikanto, we find many women who went against society for the simple cause of love. But his argument with the third, Opoya, who decides to live with the man she loves when her husband turns her out after she travels to Burma to meet him, led to a debate in several Bengali periodicals of the time. I had a couple of quotations from Manushio Mormumani, and the response to this by Srimati Usha Prabha Sen, who wrote in Bharati in response to what Sharat Chandra had depicted Abhaya as. But the deep impact of Sharat Chandra upon the different uh, aspects of, or upon the different aspects of women's freedom across the country, and his translation into so many Indian languages also inspired writers in other Indian languages like Gudipati Venkatapati Chalam in Telugu to talk of the inner life of women, which is a stark contrast to what we see in the way in which it is depicted in Bangla. So, literature's role in mass uprisings in the Indian subcontinent towards freedom implies not only freedom from imperial powers, but also from institutionalized discrimination by conventional socio religious structures and capitalist class divisions. Is the absence of the Muslim figure in the Bengali novels set in mass movements and uprising due to the rise of the two nation theory and the distanciation of Hindus from Muslims? Or should we remember at this point the work of Nujrul, who brought all the discriminations that existed in Indian society and added it to the racism and the imperial exploitation that was perpetrated by the British, and gave a call for an uprising of the masses across caste, class, gender, and race. Thank you.